A sky the color of bruised slate hung low over the rolling hills of Surrey. Ancient oaks, heavy with the dampness of an English August, stood like silent sentinels along the narrow lane. The gravel of the driveway crunched with the sound of old money as a sleek black Range Rover came to a stop before a pair of imposing wrought-iron gates. Alistair Finch cut the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the frantic rhythm of his own heart. He hadn't set foot on the grounds of Oakhaven Manor in 4 years. 4 years since a sterile courtroom smelling of lemon polish and quiet despair had awarded full custody of his son to Eleanor. He could still feel it, the phantom weight of Leo's small hand on his shoulder, the confused tremor in his 4-year-old voice asking, "Are you going away for long, Daddy?" Then the heavy oak door of this very house had closed, its final thud echoing through the years. Now he was back, unannounced, not to dredge up the past, not to fight. He just wanted to see his son, Leo, the 8-year-old boy he knew only through clinically polite emails and carefully curated photographs. How tall had he grown? Did his voice still hold that soft lilt? Or had it been polished away by the clipped aristocratic vowels of his mother's world? Did he even remember his father at all? Alistair opened the boot and retrieved a gift box. Inside was a high-tech drone, the kind of gadget Leo had once marveled at in shop windows. He had also bought a soft, stylish hoodie, a small rebellion against the perfectly starched collars he imagined his son was now forced to wear. He pressed the intercom button beside the gate. A moment later, a voice smooth and cool as marble answered, "Yes. Eleanor, it's Alistair. I'm just dropping by. I'd like to see Leo." There was a pause, a small eternity of static. Then the gate swung inwards with a silent, well-oiled grace. He drove slowly up the sweeping drive, the manor coming into view. It was just as he remembered, honey-colored stone, ivy-choked walls, a place that radiated generations of privilege. It had never felt like his home, only a gilded cage he had briefly occupied. The front door opened before he could ring the bell. Eleanor stood there, framed by the dark wood of the entrance hall. She was impeccably dressed in cream-colored cashmere and pearls, her blonde hair swept into a flawless chignon. Her smile was a masterpiece of social engineering. "Alistair, what a surprise." He managed a small nod, holding up the gift. "I was in the area. I wanted to see Leo. Give him this." A flicker of something unease, perhaps, or irritation crossed her eyes before being instantly suppressed. "Oh," she said, her voice light. "I'm afraid that's impossible. Leo isn't here." Alistair's hand tightened on the box. "He's not here. Where is he?" "He's at a preterm camp in Switzerland," she said, the words flowing with practiced ease, "for gifted children. It's a wonderful opportunity for him. He won't be back for several weeks." Alistair frowned. A camp in August. It sounded plausible enough if you didn't know the truth. The truth was that Eleanor had spent their entire marriage creating distance-building walls between his world, the world of a mixed-race boy from Brixton who had built a tech empire from nothing, and her world of inherited land and centuries-old names. She raised a delicate hand, resting it against the doorframe, subtly blocking his view of the interior. The house looked the same, antique furniture, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, but it felt different, colder. "Well," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "could you see that he gets this when he returns?" Eleanor took the box, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. "Of course. Are you well?" The question was pure formality, an empty gesture. Before he could answer, a man's voice, laced with the easy authority of someone born to rule, called from within. "Eleanor, darling, who is it?" A tall man with sandy hair and a face that might have been handsome, if not for the faint sneer permanently etched around his mouth, appeared behind her. He wore a tweed jacket and a signet ring on his little finger. Marcus Vance, Eleanor's new husband. Marcus's pale blue eyes landed on Alistair, taking in his tailored suit, his dark skin, his very presence on this hallowed ground. "Ah," he said, a thin smile playing on his lips. "My wife's predecessor." Alistair didn't react, his gaze as steady as granite. The two men stood in silence, a gulf of class, race, and history separating them. "I came to see my son," Alistair stated plainly. "As Eleanor must have told you, the boy is in Switzerland," Marcus said, folding his arms. The condescension in his tone was sharp enough to cut glass. "One must remember these things, mustn't one, having a son?" Eleanor let out a nervous little laugh. "Marcus, please." Just as Alistair was about to turn and leave, a little girl with blonde ringlets and bright blue eyes, no older than 2, toddled into the hallway clutching a porcelain doll, Mummy Biscuit. Alistair froze. It wasn't the child that stopped him, but the look that flashed across Eleanor's face, a brief, unguarded moment of pure panic. "This is Annabelle," Eleanor said quickly, scooping the girl into her arms. "Our daughter." Alistair nodded, but his eyes swept the hallway one last time. There were silver-framed photos on a console table. Eleanor, Marcus, and the little girl smiling on a yacht. Marcus and Annabelle in a field of bluebells. Eleanor holding the baby. Not a single photograph of Leo. It was as if his 8 years of existence had been completely erased. "I won't keep you," Alistair said, his voice a low, steady rumble. He turned and walked back to his car, the crunch of gravel under his expensive shoes sounding alien and loud. His heart was no longer just beating. It was hammering a war drum, sounding an alarm. Something was profoundly wrong here, and it was much, much worse than a lie about a summer camp in Switzerland. As Alistair drove away from the manor, the image of the empty hallway, a shrine to a new, perfect family with no place for his son, burned behind his eyes. He didn't turn back towards the motorway. Instead, on an impulse born of pure instinct, he took a sharp left down a narrow, unpaved track that skirted the edge of the Oakhaven estate. The lane was meant for service vehicles and farm equipment, a path hidden from the curated beauty of the main grounds. He parked the Range Rover beneath the low-hanging branches of a weeping willow, the engines ticking the only sound in the damp air. He got out and walked, his city shoes sinking into the soft, loamy earth. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that leaving felt like a betrayal. The air here smelled of wet soil and decaying leaves, a scent far more honest than the perfumed chill of the manor house. The track ran parallel to an old stone wall that marked the estate's boundary. Further along, nestled in a dip in the landscape, was a small, unassuming stone cottage, a plume of gray smoke curling from its chimney. It was the old groundskeeper's cottage. Alistair remembered the man, a quiet, weathered fellow named Arthur Gable, who had worked the land his entire life, just as his father had before him. Arthur had passed away a few years ago. As he drew closer, he saw a figure kneeling by a small, immaculately kept garden next to the cottage. It was an elderly woman, her back slightly stooped, her silver hair pinned neatly in a bun. She was tending to a bed of roses, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked up as his shadow fell over her, her eyes a pale, watery blue, showing no surprise. It was as if she had been expecting him. "Mrs. Gable," Alistair said, his voice softer than he intended. "Mr. Finch," she replied, her own voice, quiet but clear with the rustic burr of the Surrey countryside. She slowly pushed herself to her feet, wiping her soil-stained hands on her apron. "It has been a long time." "It has. I came to see my son." Mrs. Gable's gaze drifted from his face towards the distant, imposing silhouette of the manor. A profound sadness settled in her features, deepening the lines around her eyes. She didn't speak, but her silence was heavy with unspoken words. "They told me he's in Switzerland," Alistair continued, watching her face closely. "At a camp." The old woman picked up a small watering can, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle. She looked down at her roses, her voice barely a whisper. "Switzerland. That's a long way for a little boy to go on his own." The way she said it, the careful, almost painful enunciation, sent a fresh chill through Alistair. "You don't believe he's there, do you?" Mrs. Gable finally met his eyes again, and in their depths he saw a flicker of fear, but also a stubborn resolve. "It is not my place to believe or disbelieve what the mistress of the house says, Mr. Finch. I am just the old groundskeeper's widow. They let me stay on in my husband's cottage. I keep to myself." "But you've seen him," Alistair pressed, taking a step closer. "You've seen Leo." She turned away, her attention seemingly fixed on a stubborn weed near the base of a rosebush. "I see many things from my window. The seasons changing, the rooks in the elm trees." She paused, her voice dropping so low he had to strain to hear it. "And I know that some places on this estate are colder than others, especially for those who are forced to stay in them." Her words were a carefully constructed riddle born of a lifetime of knowing her place, of understanding the danger of speaking ill of her betters. But the message was clear. Forced to stay where Mrs. Gable, Alistair asked, his voice tight. "Show me, please." She hesitated, her gaze darting back towards the manor as if she feared they were being watched. "They are cruel, Mr. Finch, not in the way of shouting and screaming that the whole world can see. It is a quiet kind of cruelty, the kind that erases a person bit by bit." Her fear was palpable, but something else burned brighter, a fierce protective instinct. She had watched over this land for decades. She had probably watched Leo playing here as a toddler long before Alistair had left. "I need to know," he said, his voice raw with a desperation that stripped away all pretense. "He's my son." That was the key. Her expression softened with a pained empathy. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not towards the grand house, but in the opposite direction towards a cluster of dilapidated outbuildings at the far end of the property, partially hidden by a thicket of overgrown yew trees. "My Arthur." She began, her voice trembling slightly. "He always said the old hunting kennels were no place for any living thing. Not since the 5th Earl's time. All stone and damp, no light." She looked directly at him. Her message finally laid bare, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "No one ever goes there now. No one." Alistair's blood ran cold. The hunting kennels, a relic from a bygone era, a row of small stone enclosures where the Earl's hounds were once kept. He remembered them, vaguely solid windowless structures with heavy iron-barred doors. He didn't need to hear another word. He saw the truth in the widow's sorrowful eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," he said the words, feeling utterly inadequate. "Be careful," she whispered as he turned to go. "There is a reason the whole village stays quiet, but a child's soul is not something that should be silenced." Alistair didn't reply. He was already moving his long strides, eating up the damp ground, heading towards the yew trees and the cold stone that lay hidden behind them. Every footstep was a hammer blow, each one echoing with 4 years of absence, 4 years of lies, 4 years of a silence he was about to shatter. The path to the old kennels was barely a path at all. Nettles and brambles clawed at Alistair's trousers as he pushed through the dense curtain of yew trees. The air grew still and cold, thick with the smell of moss and wet stone. He emerged into a small, forgotten clearing. Before him stood the kennels. They were even worse than he remembered. A long, low structure of gray, lichen-stained stone built into the earth of a small hillock. It looked less like a building and more like a tomb. A series of heavy oak doors reinforced with rusted iron straps were set into the stone. Each door had a small barred grate at eye level, now choked with cobwebs and dead leaves. The place radiated a profound and chilling neglect. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. He walked slowly along the front of the structure, his footsteps unnervously loud on the flagstones. The silence was absolute. No birds sang here. He fought the urge to call out his son's name, terrified of the silence that might answer. He reached the last kennel in the row. Its door was slightly different from the others. A heavy modern padlock was latched through a thick iron hasp that had been crudely bolted into the ancient wood. It was new, shiny, a jarring violation against the decay surrounding it. Then he heard it. A sound so faint it was almost indistinguishable from the rustle of leaves in a distant tree. A soft, rhythmic scratching. Scrape, pause, scrape. He stopped, holding his breath. The sound was coming from inside that last kennel. He moved closer, his body acting on pure primal instinct. He crouched down, peering through the filthy bars of the grate. At first he could see nothing but oppressive darkness. The interior smelled foul, a cloying mix of damp, stale straw and the sharp, acidic scent of urine. It was the smell of caged misery. As his eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, a shape began to resolve itself from the shadows. A small figure huddled in the farthest corner, wrapped in a threadbare blanket that was little more than a rag. The scratching sound came again. The figure was using a small stone to etch patterns onto the damp flagstones of the floor. Alistair's blood turned to ice. His throat closed, and for a moment he couldn't draw a breath. He could make out a tangle of dark matted hair, a thin neck, the bony ridge of a small spine beneath a stained oversized t-shirt. The child's legs were pulled up tight to his chest, as if trying to make himself as small as possible to disappear into the very stone of the wall. Next to him on the floor was a metal dog bowl containing a crust of bread and a brown, bruised apple, its flesh soft with decay. The boy was gnawing on it. Not like a child eating a snack, but with a desperate, animalistic hunger that was utterly devastating to witness. Leo Alistair whispered the name, a ragged tear in the silence. The figure flinched violently at the sound, dropping the apple. He scrambled backwards, pressing himself deeper into the corner, a small, terrified gasp escaping his lips. He looked up, his face a pale oval in the darkness. His eyes were huge, wide, with a fear so profound it seemed ancient. One cheek was streaked with dirt. I'm sorry," the boy stammered, his voice a hoarse, unused thing. "I wasn't making any noise. I was quiet. He was apologizing for existing. Alistair felt a catastrophic failure in his own being, a pain so sharp and vast it threatened to break him. This was Leo. Thinner, smaller, but it was him. This was his son. The baby whose tiny fingers had once curled around his own, the toddler who had shrieked with laughter when thrown into the air. Now he was a ghost in a stone box clutching a rotten piece of fruit as if it were treasure. Leo, Alistair said again, his voice cracking. "It's me! It's Daddy!" The boy stared, his expression shifting from terror to a deep, heartbreaking confusion. "Daddy!" The word was a question full of disbelief. It was a word he had perhaps stopped allowing himself to even think. That single word shattered the last of Alistair's composure. The rage, the grief, the guilt of 4 lost years coalesced into a singular blinding point of focus. He stood up and pulled at the padlock. It was solid steel. He slammed his shoulder against the oak door, but it didn't budge. It was built to contain beasts. He looked around frantically, his eyes landing on a large, moss-covered rock at the edge of the clearing. He hefted at the stone, heavy and awkward, in his arms. With a roar that was part fury, part despair, he brought the rock crashing down against the padlock and hasp. The sound was explosive, a deafening clang of rock on metal that echoed through the quiet woods. He struck it again and again, his hands scraping raw against the stone, his muscles screaming in protest. On the 5th blow, there was a sharp crack of splintering wood and tortured metal. The hasp tore free from the door. He dropped the rock and wrenched the heavy door open. It groaned on its rusted hinges, a dry, brittle sound that grated on the nerves. A rectangle of pale gray light fell into the kennel, illuminating the squalor within. Leo cowered from the light, throwing a thin arm over his eyes. Alistair dropped to his knees at the entrance. "It's okay, son," he said, his voice gentle, desperate to undo the terror he saw in his child. "I'm here now. No one is going to hurt you anymore." He held out a hand, palm open. Leo peeked at him from under his arm. He looked at the outstretched hand, then back at Alistair's face, his own expression a maelstrom of fear and a fragile, flickering hope. He slowly, hesitantly reached out a small, grimy hand and touched Alistair's fingers. His touch was as light as a moth's wing, as if checking to see if his father was real. A phantom conjured from hunger and loneliness. The moment their skin met, the boy's fragile composure broke. It wasn't a loud cry, but a silent, convulsive sobbing. Tears streamed down his dirty cheeks, but his throat was locked tight, as if he'd been taught that making noise was a punishable offense. Alistair's heart broke into a million pieces. He gathered his son into his arms, pulling the boy's frail, trembling body out of the cold darkness and into the gray afternoon light. Leo felt impossibly light, like a bird with hollow bones. He buried his face in Alistair's chest, his small hands clutching the fabric of his father's jacket with a desperate strength. And for the first time in 4 years, Alistair held his son. He was home, but he had found him in hell. Alistair carried Leo away from the kennels, the boy's slight weight a leaden anchor in his arms. Leo didn't speak, just clung to him, his ragged breaths warming the fabric of Alistair's suit jacket. Each step back towards the manor was a step from one world into another, from the brutal, hidden reality of the kennels to the elegant, manicured falsehood of the main house. He didn't use the front entrance. He walked around to the French doors of the library that opened onto a stone terrace. They were unlocked. He stepped inside, bringing the filth and misery of the kennels into the pristine heart of Oakhaven Manor. The library was a symphony of inherited wealth. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves were filled with leather-bound books that had likely never been opened. A fire crackled in a grand marble fireplace, casting a warm glow on Persian rugs and velvet armchairs. And standing by the hearth, swirling amber liquid in a crystal glass, was Marcus Vance. He looked up as Alistair entered, his expression of relaxed superiority curdling into disbelief, then disdain as he took in the scene. His pale eyes flickered from Alistair's furious face to the small, grimy child in his arms. "What is the meaning of this?" Marcus demanded, his voice low and dangerous. He set his glass down with a sharp click. "You were told to leave." Alistair gently set Leo down on his feet, but kept a protective hand on his shoulder. The boy immediately tried to hide behind his father's legs, his eyes wide as he stared at the opulent room as if it were an alien planet. "I found my son, Alistair," said his voice a low growl, each word packed with compressed fury. "He wasn't in Switzerland, Marcus. He was in one of your hunting kennels, locked in." At that moment, Eleanor swept into the room, a porcelain teacup in her hand. "Marcus, darling, cook wants to know about the canapes for—" She stopped dead, her sentence fragmenting. Her gaze fell upon Leo. His torn shirt, his matted hair, the dirt smudged on his face. The teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the flagstone floor, the sound as sharp and final as a gunshot. Her carefully constructed mask of civility disintegrated, replaced by the same raw panic he had seen at the front door. What are you doing with him?" she breathed, her horror directed not at her son's condition, but at the fact that he was here, visible, a stain on her perfect world. "What am I doing?" Alistair took a step forward, forcing her to look, to truly see the child she had abandoned. "I'm asking you, Eleanor, how long has my son been living in a dog cage while you and your husband play lord and lady of the manor?" Eleanor flushed, a tide of crimson creeping up her neck. "You don't understand," she stammered, casting a helpless glance at Marcus. It wasn't like that. He was difficult. Annabelle couldn't sleep. "So you put him outside, with the rats and the cold." Alistair's voice rose, the sound echoing off the high vaulted ceiling. "Did you leave him a bowl of water too? Was he a good boy?" Marcus stepped forward, placing himself between Alistair and Eleanor. He was taller than Alistair, and he used his height to loom, a physical manifestation of his assumed authority. "That is quite enough," he said, his tone dripping with condescending menace. "This is a private family matter. It does not concern you." "You gave up your rights to this boy years ago." "I gave up my rights based on a lie?" Alistair shot back. His eyes locked on Marcus's. "On the promise that he would be cared for, that he would be loved. You think I'm just going to walk away from this?" Marcus's lips twisted into a sneer. The thin veneer of aristocratic charm vanished, revealing the ugly bigotry beneath. "People like you don't understand our ways, Finch. Sometimes discipline is required. The boy has challenging blood. He needs a firm hand, something you clearly were never able to provide." The insult, so casually delivered, was designed to wound, to remind Alistair of his place, an outsider, a man of color whose success could never wash away his origins in Marcus's eyes. It was a declaration of war, not just between two men, but between two worlds. Alistair felt a surge of white-hot rage, a primal urge to strike the smug, hateful face before him. But he fought it back. Violence was Marcus's language, not his. His weapon was colder, sharper. He subtly shifted his stance, ensuring the smartphone in his breast pocket, which he had activated the moment he entered the library, had a clear line of sound. Challenging blood. Alistair repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerously calm level. He let the ugly words hang in the air. "Is that what you call it? Is that your justification for treating a child like an animal?" "I am the master of this house," Marcus spat, jabbing a finger towards Alistair. "The boy is under my roof and my rules. You have no standing here. You will take—" That he gestured dismissively towards Leo, "and you will get off my property before I have you removed for trespassing." Eleanor, seeing the situation spiraling out of control, finally found her voice. "Marcus, don't," she pleaded weakly. Let's be civil." Civil Alistair let out a short, harsh laugh. "Civility ended when you put my son in a cage, Eleanor. Now this is what's going to happen. I am taking Leo with me, and then I'm going to call my lawyer, and after that, I'm going to call the police and Child Protective Services, and I will make sure the entire world knows what discipline looks like at Oakhaven Manor." He bent down and gently scooped Leo back into his arms. The boy buried his face in his father's neck, a small, trembling whimper finally escaping his lips. As Alistair turned to leave, Marcus grabbed his arm, his fingers digging in like talons. "You will do no such thing. You will not threaten my family." Alistair stopped. He looked down at the hand on his arm, then back up at Marcus's furious face. "Take your hand off me," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Now." For a long moment they stood frozen, a tableau of simmering violence. The air in the magnificent library crackled with hatred. Finally, with a contemptuous shove, Marcus released him. "Get out," Marcus hissed, "and know this, you have just made an enemy you cannot possibly comprehend." Alistair didn't grace him with a response. He turned his back on them, on the shattered teacup, on Eleanor's tear-streaked face, on Marcus's impotent rage, and walked out of the library, carrying his son away from the wreckage of his past. As he stepped out onto the terrace, he reached into his pocket and calmly stopped the recording. He now had exactly what he needed. 1 week. 7 days that felt like a lifetime. Alistair and Leo were ensconced in the sterile luxury of a suite at the Corinthia Hotel in London. It was a world of clean sheets, warm baths, and food that appeared with a quiet knock on the door. For Leo, it was so alien, it was terrifying. The first night, Alistair had found him asleep on the floor, curled up in the small space between the bed and the wall, as if seeking the familiar confinement he had just escaped. He hoarded bread rolls from room service, hiding them in his pockets with the furtive desperation of someone who believed every meal was his last. He barely spoke, communicating mostly with his eyes, vast haunted pools that followed Alistair's every move, constantly gauging, constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. For Alistair, the week was a blur of phone calls. He spoke to lawyers, to child psychologists, to private investigators. He sent the audio file from the library to his legal team, and their reaction was swift and unequivocal. It was dynamite. The cold, aristocratic contempt in Marcus's voice, the damning phrase challenging blood, was a prosecutor's dream. But it wasn't enough. Not for Alistair. He didn't just want to win a custody battle. He wanted to dismantle the entire rotten edifice of Oakhaven Manor. He wanted justice that was as public and humiliating as his son's suffering had been private and silent. His investigators discovered that Mrs. Gable was not the only one with a conscience. A young housemaid recently dismissed for dropping a tray of glasses was willing to talk. She spoke of Leo being fed leftovers of being forbidden from the main family rooms of Marcus, yanking the boy by the arm so hard he cried out. She'd been too scared to speak up before, terrified of the Vance family's influence in the village. And then came the final piece of the puzzle. An invitation forwarded by his lawyer, who still received some of his old mail. It was a thick cream-colored card embossed with a gold crest. Lord and Lady Vance request the pleasure of your company at the Oakhaven Annual Gala for Children's Aid in support of the Royal Surrey Pediatric Ward. The irony was so grotesque it was almost laughable. Eleanor and Marcus, the architects of a child's private hell, were positioning themselves as the saviors of sick children. The gala was their crowning social event of the year, a carefully orchestrated performance of philanthropy designed to cement their status as pillars of the community. It was a night where the county's elite would gather to sip champagne, bid on extravagant auction items, and applaud the generosity of their hosts. It was the perfect stage. The evening of the gala arrived cloaked in a velvety darkness. The grounds of Oakhaven Manor were transformed. Fairy lights twinkled in the ancient oaks, casting a magical glow over the manicured lawns. A grand marquee, its white canvas gleaming like a pearl, had been erected on the main lawn. The sound of a string quartet and the murmur of polite conversation drifted on the cool night air. Luxury cars lined the gravel drive, depositing men in black tie and women in glittering gowns. Inside the marquee, the scene was one of effortless elegance. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and canapes. A large screen behind the main stage displayed the crest of the charity, a stylized image of a helping hand reaching for a child's. Eleanor and Marcus stood at the entrance, the perfect hosts. Eleanor was radiant in a sapphire blue gown, her smile warm, her hand resting delicately on her husband's arm. Marcus was the very picture of landed gentry, exuding an air of magnanimous charm. They greeted their guests, accepting compliments on the beauty of the evening, blissfully unaware of the storm that was gathering just beyond the circle of light. Alistair was not there. Not yet. He was sitting in his car, parked in the same secluded service lane he had used a week ago. Beside him sat his solicitor, a sharp-composed woman named Isabel. In the back, 2 plain-clothed police officers and a senior social worker waited, their presence a quiet, formidable threat. Alistair checked the live feed on his tablet. A tiny covert camera installed by one of his investigators during the week's setup gave him a clear view of the stage inside the marquee. He watched as Marcus and Eleanor mingled, laughing, shaking hands, performing their roles with flawless precision. His hand clenched into a fist. He could feel the low, steady thrum of controlled rage building within him. Back at the hotel, Leo was safe with a specialist caregiver recommended by his psychologist. Before leaving, Alistair had knelt before him. "I have to go out for a while, Leo," he had said softly. "It's something I have to do. For you, to make sure you're never ever hurt again. Will you be brave for me?" Leo had just looked at him then, given a single tiny nod. Now, sitting in the darkness, Alistair looked at the screen. Marcus was moving towards the stage, tapping a microphone. The string quartet faded out. A hush fell over the well-heeled crowd. It was time for the host's welcoming speech. "Showtime," Isabel murmured beside him. Alistair gave a curt nod to the officers in the back. He put the car in gear, the engine purring to life. He switched on his headlights, cutting two sharp beams through the darkness, and began to drive slowly, deliberately towards the glittering marquee. He wasn't coming as a guest. He was coming as a reckoning. Inside the marquee, a warm, expectant silence settled over the 200 guests. Marcus stood at the lectern on the stage, bathed in the soft glow of a spotlight. He looked out at the sea of influential faces, bankers, judges, local dignitaries, and smiled a humble, magnanimous smile. The large screen behind him now showed a serene, professionally shot photograph of him and Eleanor holding their smiling daughter, Annabelle. The image was captioned, "Family is the heart of community." "My dear friends, neighbors," Marcus began, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. "Eleanor and I are so deeply humbled to welcome you all to Oakhaven tonight. When we look around this room, we see more than just guests. We see a community, a family. And it is for the most vulnerable in our family, our children, that we gather here with open hearts." He paused for effect, letting the sentiment wash over the audience. A few people nodded in approval. "Every child," he continued, his voice taking on a tone of quiet passion, "deserves a sanctuary, a place of warmth, of safety, of unconditional love. They are the purest among us, and it is our solemn duty, our highest calling, to protect that purity, to shield them from the cold realities of the world." As he spoke, a low, ominous rumble began to intrude from outside. It was the sound of a powerful engine growing steadily closer. Heads turned towards the marquee's entrance. Marcus faltered for a second, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face, but he pressed on, raising his voice slightly. "That is why the work of the Royal Surrey Pediatric Ward is so vital. It is a beacon of hope, a place where—" He never finished the sentence. The double-width canvas flaps at the entrance were pushed aside, and Alistair Finch stepped into the light. He was not in black tie. He was dressed in a simple, dark, and impeccably tailored suit, a stark and commanding presence against the backdrop of glittering finery. He was flanked by his solicitor, Isabel, and behind them the unmistakable figures of two police officers and a stern-faced woman holding a badge. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The quiet murmuring ceased entirely. The string quartet stopped playing mid-note. All eyes were fixed on the intruders. On stage, Marcus froze, his mouth slightly agape. Eleanor, seated at a front table, rose halfway from her chair, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Marcus finally boomed from the stage, his voice laced with outrage. "This is a private event. I demand you leave at once." Alistair ignored him completely. His gaze was fixed on the large screen behind Marcus. He gave a subtle nod to Isabel, who spoke quietly into her phone. On the screen, the idyllic family portrait of the Vances flickered and vanished. It was replaced by grainy night vision footage. The image was shaky but brutally clear, a small stone enclosure. A child, rail-thin and shivering, huddled on a bed of dirty straw, a metal dog bowl on the floor. The collective gasp in the marquee was now sharp audible, a sound of shared shock. This, Alistair's voice rang out cold and clear, cutting through the stunned silence, is the sanctuary Lord Vance provides for his stepson. "My son, Leo Finch." On the screen, the footage continued. The door to the kennel opened, and the figure of a man, unmistakably Marcus, stormed in. He grabbed the small boy by the wrist, hauling him to his feet. "I told you not to whimper again." Marcus's voice, tinny and distorted but filled with vicious anger, erupted from the speakers. "Do you hear me?" He shoved the boy hard. Leo stumbled and fell to the dirt floor. Eleanor let out a choked sob, covering her mouth with her hand. The guests were frozen, their faces a mixture of confusion, disgust, and dawning horror. They were trapped, unwilling witnesses to the demolition of a reputation. Before Marcus could react, a frail but resolute voice called out from the side of the marquee. "He speaks the truth." The crowd parted. Mrs. Gable, the groundskeeper's widow, stepped forward. She was dressed in her simple Sunday best, clutching a worn handbag to her chest, her body trembling, but her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "I have seen it," she declared, her voice shaking but carrying to every corner of the tent. "I've seen that poor child locked away like an animal. I've heard him crying in the night when they thought no one was listening." "This is an outrage," Marcus roared, finally finding his voice. He pointed a trembling finger at Mrs. Gable. "The ramblings of a senile old woman. She's trespassing security. But no security came. The police officers at the entrance stood impassively, their presence a silent, unmovable authority. Just then the social worker stepped forward, holding up her badge. "Marcus Vance, Eleanor Vance," she said, her tone official and devoid of emotion. "We are here on behalf of Surrey Social Services to investigate a formal complaint of child endangerment supported by video evidence and multiple witness testimonies. We have an emergency protection order. We are here to ensure the welfare of the child Leo." The edifice of Oakhaven Manor crumbled. The charity, the philanthropy, the carefully crafted image, it all dissolved into a sordid spectacle of abuse and hypocrisy. Marcus, his face purple with rage, finally snapped. He stormed down the steps from the stage, his sights set not on the police, but on the man who had orchestrated his ruin. He lunged at Alistair, his handsome face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "You!" he snarled, his voice a guttural roar. "You did this, you filthy upstart!" He shoved Alistair with all his force. It was a crude, violent act stripped of all aristocratic pretense. Alistair staggered back, catching his balance, but he didn't retaliate. He simply stood there, his expression unreadable, letting everyone see the lord of the manor for the violent bully he truly was. The police officers moved in instantly, intercepting Marcus, their hands firmly on his arms. "Sir, you need to calm down." It was over. The whispers had started spreading through the crowd like wildfire. The guests, once so eager to be seen here, were now edging away, their faces averted, desperate to distance themselves from the stench of scandal. The performance was finished. The truth in all its ugly, raw, and undeniable power had taken the stage. The immediate aftermath of the unveiling was not a storm, but an eerie, suffocating calm. The air in the marquee, once buzzing with polite conversation, was now thick with a toxic silence broken only by the quiet, efficient movements of the police and the social worker. The guests who had paid thousands for a seat at this prestigious event now fled as if escaping a contagion. They melted into the night, their expensive gowns and tailored tuxedos offering no protection from the ugliness they had witnessed. They averted their eyes from Eleanor, who had sunk into her chair, a porcelain statue shattered from within. They offered no words of support to Marcus, who stood rigidly between the two officers, his face a mask of impotent fury. The bubble of Oakhaven had burst. The illusion of benevolent aristocracy, so carefully maintained for generations, had been irrevocably punctured. The social worker, a calm, methodical woman named Mrs. Davies, approached Alistair. "Mr. Finch, under the terms of the emergency protection order, Leo will be placed in your temporary care pending a full investigation and family court hearing. Are you prepared to assume that responsibility immediately?" "I am," Alistair said, his voice steady. He had been preparing for this moment all week. "Very good. We will need to conduct a formal interview with you and a wellness check on the child tomorrow morning. My office will be in touch to arrange it." She handed him a card, her expression professional, yet tinged with a deep, unspoken sympathy. Alistair nodded and turned to leave. He had accomplished what he came for. He cast one last glance back into the marquee. Eleanor was now weeping, not with the performative grace of a society woman, but with the raw, ragged sobs of total defeat. Her perfect life, the one for which she had sacrificed her own son, lay in ruins around her. Marcus, meanwhile, was led away towards the manor house for questioning. He didn't struggle. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by the cold, hard realization of his own folly. He had underestimated Alistair, viewing him not as an equal, but as a low-born irritant who could be swatted away. It was a mistake born of arrogance, and it had cost him everything. The drive back to London was silent. Isabel drove while Alistair sat in the passenger seat, the surreal events of the evening replaying in his mind. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel the satisfaction of revenge. He felt only a profound, aching emptiness and the heavy weight of the task ahead. He had won the battle, but the war for his son's soul was just beginning. By morning, the scandal had erupted. The local Surrey papers, who had been preparing glowing articles about the charity gala, hastily rewrote their headlines. A disgruntled guest had leaked a short, blurry video of the confrontation to a national tabloid. By lunchtime, the story was everywhere, a viral sensation fueled by the irresistible cocktail of wealth, hypocrisy, and cruelty. "Lord of the Lies, charity host accused of caging," Stepson screamed one headline. "The Beast of Oakhaven Manor," read another, accompanied by a picture of a snarling Marcus being restrained by police, juxtaposed with the charity's logo. The phrase he had spat at Alistair challenging blood was quoted in every article, a damning indictment of his character that resonated with ugly echoes of Britain's colonial past. The fallout was swift and brutal. The board of the children's charity issued a public statement within hours expressing their horror and revulsion and severing all ties with the Vance family. Donors who had pledged large sums at the gala publicly withdrew their support. The bank that Marcus advised as a board member called an emergency meeting and summarily dismissed him. His name, once a symbol of financial probity and old money, was now synonymous with scandal. For Eleanor, the consequences were more personal and perhaps more cruel. The society women who had been her friends, the ones with whom she took tea and planned charity committees, suddenly stopped answering her calls. Her name was quietly removed from the guest lists of upcoming social events. She was excommunicated from her world with a silent, bloodless efficiency that was far more devastating than any public condemnation. She was no longer Lady Vance, the gracious hostess. She was the mother who had allowed her son to be locked in a kennel. She was in the eyes of her peers unclean. Holed up inside the silent, cavernous manor, the couple turned on each other. The love that had been built on a foundation of shared status and mutual ambition could not withstand the pressure of shared disgrace. "This is your fault," Marcus seethed, pacing the library where Alistair had first confronted him. "You and your pathetic half-breed child, you brought this curse into my house." "My fault." Eleanor's voice, stripped of its polish, was sharp and brittle. "You were the one who insisted he be kept out of sight. You were the one who put the lock on that door. You hated him from the moment you met him, because he was a living reminder that I had a life before you." Their arguments were bitter and toxic, the desperate finger-pointing of two people trapped in a prison of their own making. The grand manor, once a symbol of their power, now felt like a mausoleum, its silent rooms echoing with their recriminations. The empire of Oakhaven, which had stood for centuries, had been brought down not by an invading army but by the neglected cries of a single forgotten child. The Corinthia Hotel, with its perfumed air and hushed corridors, was a world away from the cold stone of the kennels, but for Leo it was just a different kind of cage. It was a place of bewildering softness and overwhelming space. He spent most of his first full day of freedom in a corner of the suite's living room, behind a large armchair, watching the city move through the floor-to-ceiling windows with a detached, silent curiosity. Alistair understood. He didn't try to coax him out. He didn't flood him with questions or overwhelm him with affection. He simply existed in the same space, a quiet, constant presence. He worked on his laptop at the dining table, took quiet phone calls on the terrace, and made sure that whenever Leo glanced over, his father was there, stable, unchanging. The first breakthrough, small as it was, came with food. A room service trolley arrived with a lunch. Alistair had carefully ordered simple chicken soup, soft bread rolls, a bowl of strawberries. Alistair placed a tray on the floor near Leo's hiding place and then retreated to the table to eat his own meal. For a long time, the boy didn't move. Then, slowly, furtively, a small hand snaked out from behind the chair. It grabbed a bread roll and vanished. A few minutes later, it reappeared and took another. Alistair pretended not to notice, his heart aching with a mixture of pain and relief. When he cleared the trays later, he saw that the soup was untouched, but all 4 bread rolls were gone. That night, when the caregiver was helping Leo get ready for bed, 2 of the rolls fell out from the pocket of his trousers. He had been hoarding them. The instinct to save food for a future that was sure to be lean was too deeply ingrained to be erased by a single day of abundance. The next morning, Mrs. Davies, the social worker, arrived with a child psychologist, a woman named Dr. Anya Sharma. Sharma had a calm, gentle demeanor and a soft voice that never rose above a soothing murmur. She didn't approach Leo directly. Instead, she sat on the floor some distance away and began to build a simple tower with a set of wooden blocks she had brought. Leo watched her from his safe space, his dark eyes tracking her every movement. Sometimes when big, scary things happen, Dr. Sharma said to the room at large, "Not looking at Leo, it can make us feel like we want to be very small. We might look for small, safe places, like behind a chair or under a blanket. That's okay. It's our body's way of trying to protect us." She placed another block on her tower. And sometimes, she continued, our brains can get stuck. They keep remembering the scary things even when we're safe. That can give us bad dreams. It can make us feel jumpy when there's a loud noise. Alistair watched, mesmerized. She was giving Leo a language for his trauma, a way to understand the chaos inside him without demanding anything in return. After an hour, Leo had not moved, but he had not retreated either. He was listening. Later, after Dr. Sharma had left, Alistair sat with a notebook writing down everything she had told him. Establish routine. Predictability creates safety. Offer choices, no matter how small, to give him back a sense of control. Don't force physical contact. Let him initiate. Validate his feelings, even the ones he can't express in words. It felt like learning to be a father all over again, but this time the stakes were infinitely higher. That evening, Alistair decided to try one of her suggestions. "Leo," he said softly, speaking to the corner of the room. "It's time for dinner. Would you like to eat here in this room or in the other room?" Silence. Alistair waited patient. Just as he was about to give up, a tiny voice, barely a whisper, came from behind the chair. "Here." It was a victory. A small, fragile choice, but a choice nonetheless. Alistair brought the food and set it on the floor again. This time, Leo ate a few spoonfuls of the pasta before he pocketed the bread. The nightmares were the hardest part. Alistair would be woken in the dead of night by a muffled cry from the adjoining room. He would rush in to find Leo thrashing in his bed, tangled in the duvet, his eyes wide with a terror that wasn't of the room, but of a memory. The first time it happened, Alistair had made the mistake of trying to hold him, to comfort him with a hug. Leo had recoiled with a choked scream, his body rigid with fear, instinctively shielding his head with his arms as if expecting a blow. It had nearly broken Alistair's heart. He learned. The next time, he simply sat on the floor beside the bed. He didn't touch him. He just started to speak, his voice a low, steady anchor in the turbulent darkness. "You're safe, Leo. You're in a hotel. In London. My name is Alistair. I'm your dad. The door is not locked. There are no stones on the floor, just a soft carpet. You are safe." He would repeat it over and over, a mantra against the darkness, until the boy's trembling subsided and his ragged breaths evened out. He would often stay there until dawn, watching his son sleep, a silent guardian against the ghosts of Oakhaven Manor. These were the first painful, hesitant steps on the long road to healing. The battle for Leo's future moved from the court of public opinion to the hushed wood-paneled chambers of the family division of the High Court. This was not a world of sensational headlines and viral videos, but one of affidavits, case law, and the cold, methodical dissection of family failure. Eleanor and Marcus, despite their public disgrace, were not going to surrender without a fight. They marshaled the full might of the Vance family's formidable resources. Their legal team was headed by Sir Reginald Pike QC, a legendary barrister known for his silver tongue and his ruthless ability to eviscerate witnesses on the stand. His strategy became clear from the first preliminary hearing: to concede the unfortunate but isolated incident at the kennels, while launching a full-scale assault on Alistair's character. They painted him as an absentee father, a man who had shown no interest in his son for 4 years until it suited his ego. They argued that he had abandoned his child, salving his conscience with money, while Eleanor was left to handle the day-to-day realities of parenting. "Mr. Finch sends money, to be sure," Sir Reginald argued, his voice dripping with condescension. "He is by all accounts a very wealthy man. But one cannot purchase fatherhood. One cannot simply wire transfer love and guidance. For 4 years, my client, Mrs. Vance, was the one who nursed the boy through fevers, who attended school plays, who provided the only parental stability he knew." And Mr. Finch's response to a difficult family situation: not to offer help, not to engage in dialogue, but to stage a theatrical, media-driven ambush designed to humiliate his ex-wife and her new family. They submitted glossy, professionally produced photo albums showing Leo in his early years with Eleanor at the beach on a pony opening Christmas presents. The photographs conspicuously ended around the time of her marriage to Marcus. They even had the audacity to use Alistair's race against him, albeit in the coded, insidious language of the upper class. Sir Reginald spoke of the vastly different cultural environments and the potential for instability in removing Leo from the structured, traditional setting he had always known. It was a thinly veiled argument that a mixed-race, self-made man from Brixton could not possibly provide a suitable home compared to the landed gentry of Surrey. Alistair's legal team, led by Isabel, countered with a strategy of quiet, irrefutable fact. They didn't engage in theatricals. They built their case brick by meticulous brick. First, they presented Alistair's financial records. They showed not just the consistent child support payments, but a separate trust fund he had established for Leo's education, which Eleanor had never accessed. They produced years of emails in which Alistair had repeatedly asked to see his son, only to be politely but firmly rebuffed by Eleanor with a litany of excuses. He's just getting settled in his new school. It's not a good time. He has a bit of a cold. We feel it would be too disruptive for him right now. It was a clear documented pattern of parental alienation. Next, they brought in the witnesses, Mrs. Gable gave her testimony with a quiet, unshakable dignity. She spoke of the day Leo's outdoor toys disappeared from the garden, of the way the boy's laughter had slowly faded from the estate over the past 2 years. She recounted overhearing Marcus refer to Leo as the cuckoo in the nest. The dismissed housemaid then took the stand, nervously describing how Leo was often made to eat his meals alone in the kitchen and how she was instructed to wash his clothes and bedding separately from the rest of the families. But the most powerful evidence came from Dr. Sharma. In a closed session with the courtroom cleared of all non-essential personnel, she presented her preliminary findings. She spoke of Leo's symptoms of complex trauma, the food hoarding, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the instinct to hide in small, enclosed spaces. She explained that his silence was not a sign of stubbornness, but a classic trauma response known as emotional numbing. In my professional opinion, Dr. Sharma concluded, her voice calm and authoritative, Leo has been subjected to a prolonged period of severe emotional neglect and psychological abuse. He perceives his former home not as a place of safety but as a source of significant threat. To return him to that environment would be catastrophic for his mental and emotional recovery. The final devastating blow was a piece of evidence that Alistair had hesitated to use, feeling it was an almost unbearable violation of his son's privacy. During one of his sessions with Dr. Sharma, Leo had been given paper and crayons and encouraged to draw. He had not spoken a word, but he had drawn a picture. Isabel submitted it to the court. It was a child's simple, stark drawing. On one side of the page was a large, warm yellow house with a smiling sun above it. Inside the house were 2 figures, a large one with dark curly hair and a small one holding his hand. On the other side of the page, separated by a thick black jagged line, was a small gray box-like shape with bars on the door. A tiny stick figure person was inside it, alone in the dark. No amount of legal rhetoric from Sir Reginald could erase the image. It was a child's silent testimony more powerful than any witness. The battle was a brutal, emotionally draining ordeal, but as the final day of hearings concluded, it was clear that the truth, however quietly spoken, would not be denied. The judgment was not delivered in a grand courtroom pronouncement, but with the quiet finality of a sealed document. Alistair was granted sole legal and physical custody of Leo. Eleanor's contact was suspended indefinitely pending the completion of a mandatory long-term course of psychiatric therapy. Marcus was barred from any and all contact, his name affixed to the Child Protection Register. The legal battle was over. Alistair felt no elation, only a profound sense of exhaustion. He had secured his son's safety, but the victory felt hollow, tainted by the wreckage it had left in its wake. There was one loose end. One final conversation that he felt he owed not to Eleanor, but to the future version of his son, who would one day have questions that only a mother could answer. At Isabel's arrangement, a final meeting was scheduled. It didn't take place at Oakhaven, which was now in the process of being sold to cover the Vances' catastrophic legal fees and financial losses. Nor did it take place in the sterile environment of a hotel. They met in a neutral, soulless conference room at Isabel's law firm in central London. Eleanor arrived alone. The transformation was shocking. The impeccably groomed, confident woman who had stood at the door of Oakhaven Manor was gone. In her place was a pale, diminished figure. She wore a simple gray dress that hung loosely on her thinner frame. Her blonde hair, no longer perfectly coiffed, was tied back in a simple, unadorned ponytail. The pearls were gone. The makeup was gone. The only things that remained were her eyes, which were shadowed with a grief so deep it seemed to have settled into her very bones. She sat opposite Alistair at the long, polished table. Isabel was present, a silent observer to ensure all legal protocols were followed. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was filled with the ghosts of their shared past, a whirlwind romance, a lavish wedding, the joy of Leo's birth, and the slow, corrosive decay of a marriage poisoned by class and resentment. Alistair broke the silence. His voice was not accusatory, merely tired. I need to understand Eleanor. For him. Someday he's going to ask me why, and I need to have an answer for him that makes some kind of sense. Eleanor stared down at her hands, which were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with tears, but these were not the theatrical tears of the gala. They were the slow, painful tears of genuine remorse. "There is no answer that makes sense," she whispered, her voice raspy. "There is no excuse. There is only the truth, and the truth is ugly." She took a shaky breath. "When you left, I felt like such a failure. In the eyes of my family, I had failed. I had married beneath my station, and the marriage had collapsed. All they could see was you, this brilliant, successful man, and me, the foolish girl who couldn't keep him." Her gaze drifted to the window, to the gray London skyline. "Every time I looked at Leo, I saw you. I saw your ambition, your strength, your spirit. But I also saw my own failure. I saw the Brixton boy who had conquered the world while I, with all my advantages, had ended up alone in a crumbling manor house." She paused, swallowing hard. "I know that sounds monstrous, to resent a child for who his father is, but it was there, this small, dark, hateful thing inside me, and I let it grow. Then I met Marcus. He was everything my family approved of: old money, the right name, the right background. He made me feel respectable again, safe. He promised to restore Oakhaven, to restore my place in the world. But there was a price." Her voice cracked. The price was Leo. Marcus never saw him as a child. He saw him as an impurity, a stain on the Vance family line, your stain. At first it was small things, comments about his accent not being quite right, suggestions that he play in the back gardens, not the front lawns. Then he insisted Leo eat in the kitchen. He said Leo's energy was disruptive to Annabelle. Tears were now streaming freely down her face. I went along with it. I told myself I was keeping the peace. I told myself I was choosing my new family, my new life. I chose the man who made me feel whole over the child who made me feel like a failure. The night he first suggested Leo sleep in the old stable block. "Just for one night, darling Annabelle has a cough and can't be disturbed." I knew it was wrong. I knew it in my soul. But I was a coward. I was so terrified of being abandoned again that I abandoned my own son first. She finally met Alistair's eyes, her own gaze stripped bare of all artifice. The lock on that door, I saw him put it there. And I turned and walked away. I let it happen. No one forced me. I was not abused or coerced. I was just weak. And my weakness became his prison. The confession, raw and unfiltered, hung in the air between them. Alistair felt a cold knot of understanding, but not forgiveness. Forgiveness was not his to give. He reached into his briefcase and took out a simple leather-bound journal and a pen. He pushed it across the table to her. "Write it down," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Write all of it down. Everything you just told me, write it for him. Don't ask for his forgiveness. Just give him your truth. One day when he is old enough, he can choose what to do with it." Eleanor looked at the journal for a long moment. Then, with a trembling hand, she picked up the pen and nodded. It was not an absolution, but it was a beginning. It was the first painful step in acknowledging a debt that could never truly be repaid. 6 months later, the grey pall of London had been exchanged for the soft green hills of the Cotswolds. Alistair had sold his minimalist penthouse in the city and bought a modest honey-colored stone house on the edge of a quiet village. It wasn't a manor, and it wasn't a fortress. It was a home surrounded by a rambling garden that was more wildflowers than manicured lawn, bordered by a gentle babbling brook. The transformation in Leo was not a miracle. It was a slow, quiet unfurling. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent, their sharp edges softened. He no longer hoarded food, confident now in the unwavering rhythm of 3 meals a day. He had started speaking in full sentences, his voice, though still soft, gaining a new, tentative confidence. He was enrolled in the small village school under the name Leo Finch. For the first time, he was just a boy, not the subject of scandal or a symbol of a broken marriage. He made a friend, a cheerful, red-headed boy named Sam, who was impressed not by Leo's past, but by his nascent skill at football. Alistair's own transformation was just as profound. He had stepped down as CEO of his company, taking on a less demanding role as chairman of the board. His days were no longer measured by stock prices and quarterly reports, but by the school run by shared breakfasts, by the slow, patient work of rebuilding a child's trust. He learned to bake a lopsided but edible chocolate cake. He learned to identify the constellations in the clear country sky. He learned the art of simply being present. One bright, crisp Saturday morning in early spring, a delivery truck arrived. It deposited a single, slender sapling on their lawn, its roots bundled in burlap. It was a young English oak. "What's that for?" Leo asked, his dark eyes wide with curiosity as he poked at a leaf. "That," Alistair said, ruffling his son's hair, "is for us. We're going to plant it." They spent the morning digging a hole in the center of the back garden, their hands sinking into the cool, dark earth. Alistair did the heavy work with the spade, while Leo used a small trowel to clear away loose soil, his face smudged with dirt and concentration. They worked in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the scrape of metal on stone and the cheerful chirping of sparrows in the hedgerow. When the hole was deep enough, they carefully lowered the sapling into the earth. "A tree needs strong roots to grow tall," Leo Alistair said as they began to push the soil back into the hole. "Roots keep it steady when the wind blows. They find water deep in the ground to keep it alive. This is us, you and me. We're putting down our roots here, together." Leo didn't say anything, but he patted the earth around the base of the small tree with a new sense of purpose. When they were finished, they stood back to admire their work. The sapling looked small and vulnerable in the large garden, its thin trunk swaying in the gentle breeze. It was just a beginning. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the lawn, Alistair sat on the back step, a mug of tea warming his hands. Leo came and sat beside him, leaning his small body almost imperceptibly against his father's arm. It was the first time he had initiated such casual, trusting physical contact. Alistair's heart swelled, but he remained perfectly still, not wanting to break the spell. They watched as a gust of wind rustled the leaves of their newly planted oak. "Dad," Leo said, his voice quiet. "Yes, a son. Will it get big?" "It will," Alistair replied softly. "Bigger than the house. It'll take a long, long time. It'll be here long after we're gone. Your children and their children might come and play under its branches one day." Leo seemed to ponder this vast expanse of time. He looked from the small tree to his father's face. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. "Okay," he said, as if this was a satisfactory and pleasing thought. In the desk drawer in Alistair's study inside a locked box was a leather-bound journal filled with elegant tear-stained handwriting. It was Eleanor's confession. He hadn't read it. He wouldn't. It was not his story to read. One day, many years from now, when the oak tree in the garden was strong and tall, he would give the key to Leo. The boy, by then a man, would have the strength and the roots to face the truth of his past and choose his own path to forgiveness. But for now, there was just this. A father and a son sitting together in the fading light of a spring afternoon, the smell of damp earth in the air. A small tree in their garden, and the quiet, unshakable promise of a new beginning. The wind blew, but here together they were steady. They were home.